Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to those joining us online. My name is Cecilia Engler. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Marine and Environmental Law Institute, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator for the first panel of the MELAW Anniversary Conference, a panel that will address the legal challenges, but also some pathways towards not only more effective, but also more equitable ocean conservation and management. I think the housekeeping rules are clear. We're going to hear first from our three speakers, and then we're going to open a period for question and answers. If you are joining us online, please submit the questions to the chat or the Q&A function, and we will collate them and read them here. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our three speakers today. First, we will hear from Dr. Sherry Pictou. She is an Associate Professor of Law and Management, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Governance, and Faculty Associate of MELAW. She is a Mi'kmaq woman from Bear River First Nation, Nova Scotia. Dr. Pictou is also a former chief of her community, a former co-chair of the World Forum of Fisher Peoples, and also formerly member of the Task Force on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, established by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Her research interests include decolonizing treaty relations, social justice for Indigenous women, Indigenous women's role in food and lifeways, and Indigenous knowledge and food systems. Dr. Pictou.
Kwe, Deluisi, Sherry Pictou, Nin Sagahamosk, Webexi, Eltukuk at Gaspuik. My name is Sherry Pictou, and I'm currently a female chief, the first female district chief for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. And as you heard, I'm also an associate professor here at Dow. I'm from Eltukuk, where the water cuts through high rocks, or otherwise known as Bear River First Nation, in my traditional hunting and fishing district known as Gaspuik, or otherwise Southwest Nova Scotia. Yes, and so I'm trying to learn the language. I'm not a fluent speaker, but I'm trying very desperately to start practicing the language because there's so many hidden teachings and so forth in the language, which you'll probably hear this afternoon from Professor Naomi Metallic. So just please give me a warning when I'm running out of time here, and I'll speed up as much as I possibly can. I wasn't quite sure about the time, and so this is where I'm from. We have 7 traditional hunting and fishing districts, and I love using these petroglyphs as well because it really signifies our relationship to the ocean. And of course, you can find these. This is a demonstrator where my people used to do the porpoise hunt for porpoise oil. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of Indigenous knowledge in oceans, or in ocean governance. And you have to forgive me if I have any misspellings here. This was like 5 o'clock this morning. And some of the barriers about fitting Indigenous knowledge and recent developments and moving forward. So I didn't realize this until last year, but we are in the ocean decade and Indigenous knowledge, or the decade of Indigenous knowledge in oceans. So this is really interesting, and according to the Ocean Human Rights Platform, there are 27 million Indigenous people in nearly 2,000 communities across 87 countries living in coastal areas. There are also sea, nomadic, or mobile Indigenous societies in Southeast Asia. And I find this very, very interesting because I've always been really pushing water, because we always talk about Indigenous land. And in my mind, we're talking also about water. But the way that the United Nations, the way our governments operate, they separate those. And it became clear to me that Indigenous people were being associated as being land-based, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and having nothing to do with the ocean or marine life. And this is forthcoming, a piece that I've contributed in the Third World oceans assessment, and I'll come back to that. But many worldwide ancient indigenous creation or origin stories from around the world center on life beginning with or in relation to the ocean, the sea, or water. Similarly, centuries-old archaeological shell-midden sites and petroglyphs or rock art, including those of whales or whale hunting, exist across the globe. And I just think it's so important to emphasize that. And you know, I'm from an area where there was shell heaps that were dated 2,000 years old, and it was a burial site or a temporary burial site of a woman and 2 children. And that was excavated by an amateur archaeologist back in the 60s, I want to say, and the remains was in the Nova Scotia Museum for I don't know how long till they returned those remains, and now they are buried in Kejimkujik National Park. There's an ancient burial ground there. So a little bit background. We made a lot of progress, I'd say, in later years on biodiversity, conservation, and so forth, and notably the conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity. But it's only been recent that attention has been turned to Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge. And a lot of this came, which I didn't know until my colleague with Ocean Nexus told me, was there was a series of papers they call blue papers commissioned by the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. And this is a particular important document, co-producing sustainable ocean plans with Indigenous and traditional knowledge holders. And as I said earlier, they had 2 world ocean assessments, and only until this 3rd one are they including a chapter on Indigenous knowledge. And we almost lost it. We almost lost it. It's not going to be an in-depth chapter, but a good introduction, Indigenous peoples, traditional and local community knowledge. So there is some progress being made. And again, I won't go through this. I think this is a misplaced slide, but this just shows close up the 7 districts that I'm from, and these little red dots are now reservations. So we just have reservations in our traditional territories. And of course, a lot of work, and why I've been interested, has been as a result of our own judicial agency. A lot of people think that, oh, these Mi'kmaq treaty rights were just handed to us, or these fishing rights were just handed to us. It took a lot of hard work, and it could even go back to 1927 with Grand Chief Gabriel Siloboy, who finally was exonerated in 2017, who was, it was a hunting case, but he maintained he had a treaty right. And so what I'm talking about, the judicial agency, here in the Maritimes, we have the peace and friendship treaties. And a lot of interesting history can be found in William Wicken's book, The Colonization of Mi'kmaq Memory and History, 1794-1928, where he traces the consciousness of, or the Mi'kmaq and the treaties in Mi'kmaq consciousness, and really focusing around Grand Chief Gabriel Siloboy's work. So this has led to a lot of my work, and I've seen Professor Metallica just entered the room, and my other colleague, Cheryl Simon, and very fortunate the law school is to have them as really focusing on Indigenous lens on law and what those are, and I quite frequently will look at Mi'kmaq concepts like Umsitnogama, all my relations, or Etowoptima, two-eyed seeing, and Nidaluk, or taken, the short version of that is taking what you need without compromising the ecological integrity of this resource, and a lot of storytelling and story listening, and how water is alive, it's a relative. So I'm just going really through this, and I could explain this. And of course, rid of that top part, whoops, go back. What concerned me particularly, I was quite aware of this blue economy concept with my work with the World Forum of Fisher Peoples in prior years and with some other colleagues. And it was another form, with the closer analysis, it was a form of ocean grabbing. And we talk about land grabbing. And I see, I really am going to regret missing this. I'm hoping that we can access these videos at some point, is the seabed mining. And that's going to be an interesting session. And, you know, just the language around it. Planet ocean, Earth's last frontier, ocean commodification, blue growth, blue economy. And ironically, I've learned that the concept of blue economy came from a good place, but it became hijacked. That's the issue. It should make reference to having, you know, sustainability, not economic sustainability, but sustainability. 2 minutes remain, and look at this, just to go in here. So a main barrier really lies that I contributed to this World Oceans Assessment is that we treat the ocean as being separate from the land. We conceptualize Indigenous people as only being land-based, as I said, and we assume that Indigenous knowledges need to be integrated or validated by non-Indigenous knowledge or conventional scientific methodologies. And I won't go into this quote, but it's quoting the land-sea dichotomy, where it really contravenes the holistic vision of Indigenous people. Ironically, at the time of writing that, I was also involved with sponsoring an Indigenous delegation with the World Forum of Fisher Peoples in Brazil in November of 2024, and they came up with a unity statement. And it says, our governments have separated the land from the sea in their policy making, yet Indigenous people who have coexisted and managed Indigenous ecosystems since time immemorial know that these two are intricately connected. Give you an idea. So just to kind of wrap up, some of the great work that's being done is by Ocean Nexus. It's now housed with the University of Rhode Island, and it's the only institute that, or the only entity that I know that tries to deal with social equity, ocean equity for marginalized people. And so they use like post-colonial theory, Indigenous governance theory, critical feminist theory, queer studies, et cetera, because it's they're a group of international researchers from around the world, and they see these policies moving forward, and there's very little attention given to, well, how does this impact Indigenous people? How does this impact marginalized people, and so forth? Another project that I'm involved with is a big project, is AERMAT, and we have like currently 70 projects from around the world that are Indigenous-led. And then we have these pathways. Now I'm responsible for pathway T3, recognition of Indigenous rights and sustainable use, with my colleague Dr. Tony Charles, who has done a lot of work in ocean governance. And since wrap up, I'll just hang on in here for a second. And he's currently, we're currently putting a chapter in an FAO technical paper on small-scale fishery access issues, and this will be case studies on Indigenous peoples and fisheries in Canada. And of course, I can't let this go without mentioning gender. And this is, I won't go all into this, but this is a report that I did on 2 groups of women here in the Maritimes, Olga and the Mi'kmaq grandmothers who were defending their lands, but basically river systems that lead to the ocean and so forth. And thanks to my colleague Sarah Seck, we have a forthcoming chapter, Indigenous Governance, Gender and Engagement with Right Holders, and Lessons from Canada through Environmental Human Rights. And this will be in a book in Contested Consultations in the Extractive Industries. And she really helped me to give some focus on that report. And this will be released shortly. It's been a long time coming. We've been working with Mi'kmaq women fish harvesters here in Nova Scotia. Very interesting. I wish I had time to go into that, but very, very interesting. And also, I really love what the International Oceans Institute is doing, Michael Butler, and he works with DFO and so forth, but they've been hosting these annual coastal and ocean governance for Indigenous peoples. And we have a lot of people throughout Mi'kmaq and even with Penobscot that attend these. And I work on the section Introduction to Coastal and Ocean Governance, Law of the Sea, UNDRIP, Laws, Treaties, Acts, and Social Equity, along with Rosalie Francis. Some good news is that we're trying to bring back some of our Mi'kmaq concepts to the fisheries. And I just wanted to end, I can't pronounce this, Naomi, but Unuwe Wigwam, but I don't know that second word. She's worked hard to build this project that really explores Mi'kmaq, Indigenous laws, and I have a research lab with Wiskudama, and I'm still learning to pronounce that, and Bernie Francis, our linguist, helped me with that, and it's working with Earth, not over Earth, and he was very careful to do that. So that is just really very brief. Sorry that if I went over, and to just give you an idea. Get out of that now. Can I get out of this here?
Thank you, Sherry, for that very interesting and very dense presentation with lots of information about new developments in ocean governance. Our next speaker, I don't know who can share his screen at the time. He is Dr. Hu Haidan. He joins us from Vietnam. He's a researcher in international law. He holds a JSD in International Environmental Law from Dalhousie University and a professional master in International Trade Law from Paris 5th University. He is an expert at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He heads the Center for Asian and Maritime Cooperation of the EC Institute. His area of expertise includes international law, law of the sea, and international environmental law, with a geographical focus on Southeast Asia and South China Sea.
So the BBNJ agreement, when it was adopted 2 years ago, it had received a lot of praises from all around the world. The International Institute for Sustainable Development, a Canada-based research institute, called it a triumph for multilateralism. The European Union called it a win for the ocean. So, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, do you agree with those statements? I think that most of us would agree with those statements, except one person. He is His Excellency Ambassador Yuri Gala-Lopez, permanent resident of Cuba to the UN. For him, the BBNJ agreement has been first and foremost a victory for developing countries. You know, successful people have their own way. But if you read the provisions relating to developing countries in the BBNJ agreement, I think you tend to agree with him. So the BBNJ agreement talk about applying the principle of common heritage of mankind to manage marine genetic resources. It provides that benefits arising from the activities with respect to marine genetic resources beyond national jurisdiction shall be shared in a fair and equitable manner. It also has a very robust section on capacity building and transfer of technologies. It calls for the international community to assist developing countries to implement the BBNJ agreement through capacity building and transfer of marine technologies. It also established financial mechanisms to help developing countries. For instance, it established a voluntary trust fund to facilitate the participation of representatives of developing countries. It also established a special fund and a GEF trust fund for capacity building projects. So if you look at those provisions, you would think that is a very favorable agreement for developing countries. However, you know that in international law, the devil lies in its implementation and not in its provision. So if you look at the implementation of similar provisions in another treaty, in another agreement relating to the deep sea and the high sea, which is the deep seabed mining regime, you will find that the implementation, the provision relating to developing countries have some limits. First, the limits of the principle of common heritage of mankind in reality. In reality, the common heritage of mankind had turned into the common heritage of state kind. It means benefit sharing only applies to states which are members of UNCLOS. It does not apply to non-state entities. It does not apply to non-sovereign territories. And most importantly, it does not apply to our future generations. And with the US deciding to go ahead with unilateral mining of deep seabed resources, we can wonder whether we need an international bureaucratic machinery to implement the principle of common heritage of mankind, or we just need to leave the implementation of the principle to countries by themselves. How we can share benefits suitably? 30 years after the entry into force of the agreement to implement Part 11 of UNCLOS, no regulations on benefit sharing have been adopted by the International Seabed Authority, among other regulations which have not been adopted. And only suggestions for regime of benefit sharings, which have been suggested to the ISA, have its own flaws. Finally, people talk about certain technological colonialism in this deep seabed mining technologies transfer. It means that there's very limited access for developing countries to deep sea mining technologies. On the capacity building projects and initiatives which have been undertaken has been quite superficial, which means it does not focus on the real needs of developing countries. And finally, it have led to a certain level of brain drain and dependence. It means that developed countries would train experts from developing countries for deep seabed mining, but then the experts would work for the developed countries. So developing countries would stand to lose twice. First, they will not be able to acquire the necessary technologies, and second, they would lose the experts, who are sometimes the best mind that they have. So based on that, I would like to suggest how we can proceed in order to have a more effective participation of developing countries in the BBNJ agreement implementation. First, I think we should create an effective and user-friendly clearinghouse mechanism under the BBNJ agreement. We all know that the clearinghouse mechanism will play a very important role in the implementation of the BBNJ agreement. It will have developing countries to monitor closely what happened in terms of marine genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So I think it would be one of the main provisions of the BBNJ agreement. However, from the experience of establishing international database that we had before, sometimes international databases have been quite complicated to navigate. Some international clearinghouse mechanisms have been quite a maze. It is very difficult for people when they go to those websites to retrieve information that they need. I would not name those badly designed clearinghouse mechanisms. However, I would like to point to a good one, which is the clearinghouse mechanism under the Convention on Biological Diversity. I think it is very user-friendly, it is very well maintained, and it's most importantly, it is very updated and it's very easy to navigate. So I think that we need this kind of clearinghouse mechanisms to be implemented under the BBNJ agreement. Second, I think we should establish custom-based capacity building and technology transfer programs for developing countries. First, I think we should let developing countries to suggest themselves what do they want to strengthen, what kind of technologies they want to acquire, because developing countries know the best what their needs are. And second, I think we should focus on developing homegrown capacities. So instead of taking the expert to do training workshop in some laboratories in a foreign country, it should have developing countries to build laboratories in their own countries, so that it will lead to a more sustained capacity building, more independent capacity building for them to use in the future. For instance, we can establish Center for Marine Biological Research in developing countries with their own experts. I think we also need to create a global benefit sharing fund This fund would be financed through contributions from commercial users of marine genetic resources and from patent fees, and it would serve to support scientific research, infrastructure, and capacity building in developing countries. I think that by using contributions from commercial users and patent fees, it would be more sustained than to just depending on voluntary donations. So those are my suggestions in order to have a more effective participation of European countries whose implementation of the BBNJ agreement. Now, I would like to have a question for you. In your opinion, what is the most important institution in implementing the principle of common heritage of mankind, the deep seabed mining regime? I think that we would all agree that it would be enterprise, which had the responsibility to mine the area, the international seabed, for the sake of international community. However, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, have any of you seen the enterprise so far? Me, I have seen in science fiction movie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dang, for that very interesting and very concrete suggestions on how to improve capacity and participation of developing states. Our third speaker today is Dr. Olga Koubrak. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at Dalhousie University, where her current research looks at transboundary fisheries management in the context of climate change. She holds a PhD from Dalhousie University and has published on ocean-related issues at both national and international level. Olga also leads Sea Life Law, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of endangered marine species. Through Sea Life, Olga advocates for better domestic implementation of international obligations and improved protection for sea turtles, sawfishes, and sharks.
So, for those of you who don't know, why are you not moving? Here we go. United Nations Environment Program, Regional Seas Program, so it's a program within a program, which has 18 individual programs, so lots of programs within programs, is one of the largest, if not the largest, environmental program in the world. It was started in 1972 when countries began to realize that to solve common marine problems, and at that time was mostly marine pollution, they had to work together. So between 1972 and 1974, UNEP led countries around the Mediterranean Sea in negotiating a common action plan. So as you can imagine, the Mediterranean Sea has countries from Europe, countries from North Africa, which are quite different, not only in their political priorities, but also in their culture and their values. So UNEP gets a lot of credit for bringing these countries together and actually agreeing on a common way forward. So over the next 10 years, the Regional Seas Program grew exponentially. We went from one program in the Mediterranean to 8 programs all over the world, sort of in the span of 10 years. So between 74 to like 84, 86, 8 more programs were added. And now we're 18 programs with 146 countries. And these programs have different formats. In a sense, some kept the action plans as a non-binding foundation of their programs. Others subsequently negotiated binding treaties based on the action plan. UNEP acts as a secretariat for some of these programs, and then other programs use other intergovernmental organizations as their secretariat. So given the diversity of the different programs, it is an excellent opportunity, it presents an excellent opportunity to study. However, it's been not studied a lot. It's kind of been flying under the radar, and so my literature review was quite limited, and was able to do it pretty fast because there's not much written, especially when it comes to biodiversity protection. So for my project, I selected 4 case studies. I mean, initially I did want to do all 18, but it quickly became obvious that that was not going to happen. So I had to narrow it down to 4. And the 4 that I selected was the Nairobi Convention, which is East Africa, the OSPRA Commission, which is Northeast Atlantic, Mediterranean, as I already mentioned, and the Caribbean. So these 4 programs, the reason I selected them was because they gave me all of them had binding obligations to protect endangered species. Some of them had a general obligation, and for example, the OSPRA Convention had a general obligation to protect marine biodiversity in general, which you can then translate it into protecting endangered species. The other 3 had the specific, we're going to identify species that need protection, and and here's the list of obligations that they need to, countries need to follow. They are also, so they had all had the binding obligations, but they were different in terms of their geography and composition. So some of these programs had a mix of developing countries, and other programs were dominated by developed countries or developing countries. So I thought it would be an interesting way to look at a cross-section of these regional seas programs. But since I was looking at the effectiveness of the regional seas programs in protecting marine endangered species or marine species at risk, I obviously had to tackle the question of, well, what is effectiveness and how do you measure it? In a way, it's easy when we intuitively understand what effectiveness means. It means, a certain solution actually addresses the problem that led to its creation, right? But when you're dealing with a complex program such as the Regional Seas Program, there are too many variables that need to be taken into account. I can't just establish causation because Regional Seas Program exists. Marine endangered species are being protected or not being protected. There are just way too many other factors that are at play. So I kind of cheated and I adopted Bachman's, this another scholar who looked at effectiveness. And what she suggested is that we don't have to prove causation. So what we can do is look at the potential effectiveness. And that's what I did. I basically did not establish that the regional seas is good, is effective, or not effective, but I just looked at, okay, potentially if all the factors that I've identified, if they're in place and they're being properly implemented, does this program has the potential to protect and recover marine endangered species? And so the next question, so once I sort of defined my effectiveness, the next question I had to address was basically, well, how do you measure it? So here, again, depending on the scholars, there are many different ways to do it because everybody's looking at a bit of different angles. So for me, that meant looking at the literature on institutional design, for example, as well as the biological science sort of conservation literature to see what are the elements that are necessary to recover endangered species. So based on that combination of sort of the legal factors and the biological factors, I came up with a criteria consisting of 2 broad categories. So first we looked at the legal and institutional design, and then the second set of factors that are on the next slide, I looked at regional implementation. So for legal and institutional design, the things I looked at is basically obligations and exemptions. So obligations, are they specific obligations for specific species? For example, do not kill, do not harass, or are they general obligations, for example, protect marine biodiversity? So the programs that had specific obligations were assigned a higher score. So I was actually comparing the 4 programs to each other. So for example, a program like in the Caribbean that has specific obligations to protect species that are on its annexes received a relatively higher score than a program, for example, in OSPAR, Northeast Atlantic, which just had a general obligation. Similarly, exemptions, specific narrow exemptions versus broad exemption. Listing process is basically how did countries, those programs identify the species that they were focusing on. If there was a mechanism to introduce technical review, so it was not just politically dominated, received higher scores. I also looked at parties and observers. Who were the parties? Are the developing countries developed countries? Are observers allowed? And if so, how difficult is the accreditation process? What's the institutional structure? Do we have a decision-making body? Do we have additional bodies, for example, like regional action centers that support implementation? Again, programs that had more of those, more detailed institutional structure got higher scores. And finally, whether or not there was some sort of an implementation review. Again, programs that had an implementation review received higher scores. Now we're looking at the regional implementation. I look to see, well, what kind of species were protected? Because you would be surprised, this is a regional seas program that you would think that it's dedicated to marine, but there were quite a large number of terrestrial species on some of these lists as well. So I'm still not sure how the purpose and how it all works, but I gave higher scores to the programs that were focused on marine species and lower scores to the programs that also had a whole combination of terrestrial species in there as well. Recovery plans and activities, obviously very important to to helping the species recover. You need to have some sort of a plan. So programs that had plans received higher scores. Habitat protection, self-explanatory. Are there any obligations with respect to that? Cross-sectoral cooperation, as you recognize, protecting and recovering endangered species requires a lot of different parties working a lot of different agencies working together. So fisheries is involved. For example, land-based, so farming could be involved because of land-based sources of pollution. So you need to have different cooperative mechanisms between these, the Regional Seas Program, as well as other agencies that work on similar issues. And then finally, I looked at whether climate change, ecosystem approaches, and sustainable development were addressed by those programs as well. And so here are the results. And what I want you to take away from that is basically, although none of the categories received high scores across all programs, you have leaders in all categories. So there are basically, and this is on the second one, here again, we have a bit of a mix. So we have case studies that we can do. There are best practices that we can adopt. There's lots of learning that is available that can be incorporated across the different programs to bring everybody up to speed. And based on that, these are my conclusions, is that we have the legal obligations in place, we have the institutional structure, we know what species are endangered. But then when it comes to actually putting together recovery plans that are incorporating climate change, that adopt ecosystem approaches, and that are compatible with sustainable development, that's where we kind of fall short. And this brings me to future direction. Transparency and accountability, what I found doing this research is that some programs were much better in terms of getting their information available. So I think the Nairobi Convention, for example, is probably I underestimate its effectiveness because it was very difficult to find information. So just improving access to information so scholars can evaluate it will be very advantageous. Improving the integration of social, economic, and environmental concerns. So here I'm talking about applying the ecosystem approaches, having some sort of a mechanism to bring in, to implement sustainable development, such as, for example, through environmental impact assessments. That needs to be worked on, and I think that'll get us better results. Toil analysis of the Regional Sea Program, I think, would be very interesting because we are having, developing countries working together, so putting that colonial lens on it, I think, will also give us some very interesting insight. And finally, initiating the United Nations General Assembly review, just kind of bring in an outside body to review, have a systematic review of the program, I think also will be quite valuable. Thank you so much.
It was interesting to me that there was different levels of regional implementation based on your last slide. And that made me wonder, you also mentioned that the different regional seas programs have different participation from developed states and developing states. So could you take any lessons from our second speaker, Dr. Dung, on how to improve capacity of developing states in order to improve implementation in the regional seas programs?
Well, that's $1 million question, to be honest. And I think I would follow the previous speaker's sort of lead and say, well, the developing countries know best. So I think, from my perspective, is that I work with the Secretariat of the Caribbean program quite a bit, and what I'm encouraging them to do is to engage in more bilateral discussions with countries that we're trying to involve more in the participation, to participate more, for example, in the working groups or in the meetings, and see like what are the barriers to their participation. Some of the barriers we already know, in a sense that they just don't have the expert capacity within like some of the countries that were like in the Caribbean, for example, are quite small, so they just don't have the personnel to be able to be experts in everything. So there has to be some sort of, I think we were discussing it last night, there has to be some sort of a regional mechanism where we can have access to regional experts. So my argument would be then that the Regional Seas program could be like the forum to bring together regional experts who then would potentially maybe be teaching or providing capacity developing activities to countries based on the needs that they've identified themselves.
So do you see room for bottom-up building of regional seas programs in that sense? Meaning?
I think you need a combination, right? Because you obviously need direction and you also need leadership, someone to, like UNEP, for example, if UNEP is the secretariat, then you need that push for countries to, get things done. But at the same time, if, they're getting pushed in the direction that they really don't want to go, nothing is going to get done. So you need that dialogue to see sort of, okay, this is where we need to go as a region, here we will go into the country, here, basically there has to be some sort of a dialogue, like up, down, and the other way around.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes? Maybe you can come to the podium so the people online can also hear you.
All right.
Thank you very much, Olga. I will have had a lot to say on regional seas, but only a few points. Indeed, you have made a good comparison, but what needs to be known, and you will have seen on your graph, the regional seas which have developed countries are at a higher score than the developing countries, and mainly because, like the Nairobi Convention, also the Caribbean, first, the parties are obliged to cover the cost of running the secretariat and the work. So where then the funds are limited, that also indicate the inadequacy of the implementation of that treaty. You have proposed in terms of future direction looking at initiating a UNGA resolution. I won't go to the UNGA, you have an environmental assembly, but also we need to remember each convention has its review process through its conference of the parties. And if anything beyond that is the UN Environment Assembly, then which will call for such review and not the General Assembly. I don't think it will have that mandate.
Yeah.
So I thought those are a few points I can raise there. You have also, yes, indeed, probably the literature is not that much there, but if you ask the organization, you will get it all, because all have secretariats and all have their regular conferences of the parties. Nairobi had the recent one in Madagascar, for instance. Barcelona, they will have theirs this year, but Barcelona is far ahead. And also, in terms of the issues, I think it's important also to underline when these instruments were negotiated. When you look at most of them, climate change was not known then as we know today. Any new instrument today, obviously climate change gets a upper hand, but these are all treaties.
Yeah.
When you look at Nairobi, OSPA, Barcelona, 1995, all treaties. So obviously you can understand why some issues were not issues at the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those clarifications. Thank you. I much appreciate that.
I'd like to just get in on this international developing and developed countries, and I just wanted to say, a lot of my fight personally has been on this notion of developed and developing, and I understand why that is in the United Nations and the global economy and so forth, but on the bigger scale, just what my colleague was saying, the cost of participating in what? What is the cost of participating? Who is setting those standards? And there's always seems to be a cost to participate, and it's really a way to integrate into the global economy. And why I'm saying that is because I'm from a so-called developed country, and I used to explain to people at the United Nations that I said, I'm the exploited from an exploiter country. That's how I would say. Because there's this notion out there somehow that developed countries have all the answers. But theoretically, when you look at the mess that we are in now, with climate change, with the oceans and so forth, I don't think we've done a pretty good job. And so why do we want to participate in that? And I just wanted to leave that because this is something that we have a hard time when you talk about Indigenous knowledge. You're trying to integrate it into a system that caused the marginalization to begin with. And so I always talk about, you know, who benefits, what are we integrating to, and even the notion of equity. What does that mean? My people now are dealing with like the economic, you know, consequences of participating in the economy. So I just wanted to say that, and it's because with, I remember I couldn't make it to the first international fisheries meeting way back when, because I got deadly sick, and so a colleague went, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans said, we don't have no fishery issues with Native people in Canada. And I was like, what? This was like, you know, this was back quite a few years ago, 2009. And said, but we can help you. We can help your countries implement better management practices. And I made sure I was at that next Kofi meeting, I'll tell you. But anyways, I just wanted to share that with you.
I think we need to wrap up this first session. It was a pleasure to have the three speakers. Thank you so much for joining us from Vietnam, Dr. Dang. And we can continue the conversation in the next panels and during coffee breaks and lunches. Thank you so much.